Good morning. How are you? And thank you, Sarah, for such a nice introduction. I should note that Sarah and I worked at the Post together uh, when I first started in 1988. She had already been there. And that was way back in the print-only days. It's hard to imagine that now. There was no internet, no Facebook. If you wanted news, you got it on ink and paper. You remember ink and paper? It seems like a long time ago. And so thank you, Sarah, for reminding me that I'm old. I am honored to be asked to give this presentation because I know of the work of UCC, and I did back when I was a reporter reporting in the 90s on the FCC. A quick anecdote, when I was a reporter at their Post, I'd sometimes come across a filing from the UCC, and I thought, why is a church group filing on these particular issues? And then I read up, because it was one of those rabbit holes, about the long activism and communications policy, including advocacy for civil rights, about the WLBT case and its role, Everett Parker's role, particularly in spurring the EEO rules. And at that point, my question changed. I thought, why aren't more church groups filing petitions at the FCC? We all have a stake in these issues, and we should all be involved. In any case, I am honored to be here. I want to start off by telling you about a trip I recently took. This is going to sound like an essay entitled, What I Did with My Summer Vacation, but please bear with me. There's a real point here. I hope it will make you understand something you've probably heard a lot about, and that's the crisis in local news and what that crisis actually means to real people. In August, I traveled to a little town called Cairo, Illinois. Cairo is spelled C-A-I-R-O, like the city in Egypt, but as I quickly found out, it's pronounced Cairo. I went there to report for the Medill School's annual project called the State of Local News, which was mentioned. The 2024 report will be out in a few weeks. In any case, Cairo is a very interesting place with a fascinating history. It's located at the bottom of Illinois, at the point where the Mississippi River and the Ohio rivers meet, kind of like the Potomac and the Anacostia. And if you're looking at a map, I had to look at this map several times to figure this out, Missouri is on the left and Kentucky is on the right. It's closer to Memphis than it is to Chicago. It's basically the most northern town in the south or the most southern town in the north. And this location is very important. It's a key to its history. If you were a slave in Missouri, Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, or even deeper south, Cairo was the first patch of free soil that you could reach by going up the Mississippi. It was the promised land. There's a scene in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which I reread for about the fourth time this summer, in which Huck and Jim, the fugitive slave, are floating down the Mississippi past St. Louis, and they think they see Cairo in the fog, and they rejoice because they think they've made it. They think they can now head north up the Ohio River and go deeper into freedom. Tragically, they're mistaken because they bypassed the town in the fog and floated deeper into slave territory. And it's an accurate story in a way, because many of the town's residents can trace their family history to the migration out of slavery and into freedom. Well, anyway, after the Civil War, Cairo grew a lot. It was a steamboat port, it was a railroad and ferry terminus, it had agriculture, it had timber, it had coal, it had a little bit of manufacturing as well. And the people who promoted it suggested it was going to be a boom town. It was going to be the next St. Louis, the next Cincinnati, the next Louisville, the next mighty river city. It didn't happen. The steamboats got replaced by diesel barges. The ferries got replaced by bridges. The railroads got replaced by highways and interstates. And that's an old story. The town declined and began to steadily lose people, particularly its young people, which I think is the most injurious thing that can happen to a place. And not unrelated to this decline, Cairo had lots of racial tension. In the late 60s and the early 70s, some of the descendants of those slaves that settled there, they rebelled against the white-dominated establishment, protesting against police brutality and hiring discrimination. It tore the town apart. More people left as a result. And then, a few decades later, came the internet, which no one recognized as devastating, but it was. In 2020, as a result of the internet and all that it eroded, the local newspaper, the Cairo Citizen, closed after 156 years of publication. Gone. The newspaper office, which I visited, is now an Elks Club. Today, Cairo and the county, it's in Alexander County, doesn't have a single professional source of news. There's no newspaper, there's no digital site, there's no TV or radio station or ethnic publication. There's not even a blog that I could find. It's a news desert, classically. As I'm sure you know, that's not exactly an unusual result these days. According to the Medill School count, there are 212 counties in America that are news desert, and then there are 228 more that are on their way to becoming news deserts. That's 450 or so counties out of about 3,000. Those counties are home to about 55 million people. And it gets worse. On average last year, 2 newspapers a week, most of these are weeklies, went out of business. Right now, about half the counties in America have only one news source. And many of the places that arguably aren't news deserts are served by what has become known as ghost newspapers. They exist on paper, but they're produced by a skeleton staff, sometimes from somewhere outside the community. So even the real newspapers in a lot of these places are a shadow of what they used to be due to the relentless amount of cutbacks. It's not just happening in poor, rural, and isolated communities either. News deserts are common in places that have older populations, that are less densely populated, and where people have lower levels of education. Interestingly, Medill found this, it's happening in places that have a lot of evangelicals and a lot of white retirees. I think that bears a little more investigation as to why it's happening there. There's also a kind of de facto redlining that's going on as all of this happens. And by that I mean, many of the digital news startups that you've probably heard so much about are located in big cities and in prosperous suburbs. They're not going to the places where there are news deserts, the places where there is arguably the most need for this kind of information. Economically, they don't want to take the chance. The disappointing fact is that there are very few examples of startup news operations to fill the void in places like Cairo. Okay, so what is the news desert? What does a news desert look like and feel like? And that's why I went to Cairo in the first place. I have to say my first impression of the place was not terribly promising. The main drag, which is called Washington Avenue, it's lined with a lot of crumbling, empty storefronts and abandoned buildings. The commercial street, which is called Commercial Avenue, the heart of the business district, doesn't have too much business or commerce going on there. And Cairo is a place that lacks a lot of things, not just a newspaper. There's no drugstore, there's no gas station, there's no movie theater, not a lot of places to eat or buy groceries. The city hospital shut down in 1986. Housing especially the affordable kind, is in short supply too, which is true of a lot of communities, especially after the federal government decided to tear down a couple of big housing projects. But it's also, I found, a community that's rich with people who care a lot about this place. And I was pleased to meet some of them. They were very welcoming. And one of the things they told me was that if you want to know what's going on in a place that doesn't have a professional source of information, you have to rely on word of mouth. You have to rely on your neighbors. People have been doing that, I guess, since the beginning of time. But, you know, at the same time, people in Cairo don't lack for information about what's going on right here. They don't lack for what's going on in New York or what's happening in Hollywood. There's no need to worry about people not getting national news. The presidential campaign is as actively covered by news sources that are available in Cairo as it is in Washington, D.C. CNN, NBC, CBS, PBS, Fox News, papers like the Washington Post and the New York Times. Those sources of information are easily accessible and they're free, some of them at least. But what if you want to find out about the Cairo City Council? Try finding anything then. It's pretty hard. And back to that word of mouth thing is the problem in talking with your friends is that's not a very reliable way to get information. People like to gossip. They like to brag. They like to exaggerate. They get a lot of stuff wrong. Reporters do that too, but they do it more often. And they can be very mean and cruel to each other. If you've ever looked at Facebook or Instagram, you'll know this. So when the Cairo Citizen folded in 2020, the first things to go for people in the town was news about how the government is or is not functioning. News about the cops, the courts, the mayor, the city council, the school board, the county housing authority. And that's the stuff that an informed citizenry needs to know how to govern itself. You know, how democracy is supposed to work. Here's a small example that a fellow named Stephen Tarver, who's a local activist, told me about. He mentioned that the city council was considering renewing the city's contract with the local power utility for the next 10 years. And this is the kind of thing that we in the newsroom used to call a DBI story. Anybody? No? DBI stands for dull but important. And in Cairo, it's really important. About a third of the people who live in town are living below the poverty line. That's about 3 times the national rate. And any increase in utility rates is going to make a huge difference in their lives. Now, obviously, the city council knows about these negotiations and the utility knows about these negotiations. But what about the ratepayers? What about the citizens? What about the users of this utility? Do they know about it? And wouldn't they like to have a voice in this? I'm sure you can find some mention of this on somebody's Facebook page, but I don't think it's the most reliable way to get complicated information about this, negotiation. Mr. Tarver knows what academic studies about news deserts have long borne out, and that it's that the lack of local news means people aren't just less informed, but they are less engaged in governing themselves. He said people don't get involved because they don't know what's at stake. And let me just also say that when people in Cairo do get something like local news, it's not very local at all. It comes from a distance. There are 4 daily newspapers in the region and several television stations in the area, but none of them is closer than 35 miles from Cairo. And some are even further away, which means they don't cover DBI stories. or anything else often for weeks and months that's going on in Cairo. It's important to understand what they do cover. What they do cover is the sensational and the lurid, the extreme and the unusual. So Cairo isn't in anyone's news until something horrendous happens, which it occasionally does. And this is very destructive. These sporadic stories reinforce a one-dimensional caricature of this community. And the reason for that is there's so little else to find out about Cairo that you only hear about the bad stuff. I like to call this news imperialism. It's the conquest by the distant news haves of the news have-nots. They've colonized the place. But in talking with people in Cairo, you quickly find out what people really miss isn't just the government news, the big stuff. They miss the small stuff too. It's the little things that give a town like this its shape, its character, its flavor, and really its cohesion. It's graduations, it's weddings, family reunions, obits, church and community news, the stories about the kid who scored the winning basket or starred in the school play or died serving his or her country. People might even already know about some of these things. It's a small town after all, and everybody talks. But seeing them in the local paper validates the event. It creates history, it creates memory, it creates something lasting so that people who don't know anything about the town can find out about it. I've written for publications for more than 40 years. Yes, I'm old. And I haven't saved very many of the things that I've written. But you know what I have saved? I've saved the clips that mention my children. I cherish those way more than my stories about the FCC. And now, I don't think I'm all that different. You multiply that by every kid in every town and every parent and every grandparent of every kid in every town, and you quickly sum up what's being lost. I love what a guy named Don Patton, a guy I talked to there, a lifelong resident of Cairo, told me. He said, just as background, Mr. Patton delivered the Cairo Citizen when he was in 8th grade. He's now 73 and retired, and he's lived there all his life. He said, a newspaper gives a town or city life. You know the people you're reading about. You identify with them. It gives us a sense that we are a community. So the question is, what do we do about the ever-growing loss of local news? There are a number of things going on, and you may have heard about some of them. And faced with this slow-moving crisis, philanthropies have stepped in. There's many of initiatives that are philanthropic in nature to help the press, but I'll mention just one of them. It's the Press Forward effort, which has been organized by the MacArthur Foundation. They put together a coalition of about 25 different philanthropies to fund news startups and news operations. They announced this last year, and they're going to distribute $500 million over 5 years to help shore up existing news operations and start new ones. It's a good start, but given the size of this problem, it's really just a drop in a river the size of the Mississippi. Meanwhile, there are a number of proposals rattling around some state legislatures to help local news, and I should also say in Congress. Some of these measures have even passed. The state of Illinois, for example, since we're talking about Cairo, Illinois, in May passed a law granting $25 million in tax credits to local news organizations that hire and retain journalists. Again, that's laudable, there's no question. It's not going to help the Cairo Citizen, which is dead and gone, and maybe dead and gone forever. Which leads me to this observation. It took a few generations to erode our information infrastructure, and it will take another generation or longer to build it back up, if we can build it back up. We need more help from the government, federal, state, and local. It pains me to say that because we, as members of the press, want to keep our distance from the government. We cover the government. We don't have any ties to it, certainly financial. But if journalism is essential for preserving democratic self-government, maybe democratic self-government should preserve journalism. And so here is my big wind-up. This is the part where you all come in. You who make policy, you who affect policy, and you who just care about policy. I urge you, as a certain former First Lady said recently in a different context, to do something. Do something. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you for having me.